Happy August. I cannot believe it's already August of 2021. The time is flying by. Thank you for all of you that are joining us live this afternoon, morning, and evening. Great to see you here. Feel free to pop into the chat and let us know where you're hailing from. So excited to have all of you joining us worldwide. My name is Dr. Shamini Jan. I'm the founder and CEO of the Consciousness and Healing Initiative, who are hosting this webinar, and I couldn't be more thrilled for our guests today. First, we have a very, very special host who many of you may recognize as our co-host for the Science and Spirituality Summit that we held with Shift Network, Dr. Paul Mills. Paul will be interviewing Mr. Vikas Srivastava, who comes to us with decades of experience in implementing mindfulness and restorative practices for children as an educator, as an administrator, a teacher, and a counselor. We are absolutely thrilled for this conversation, and I'm just here to orient all of us. If you're joining us new on the Chi platform, thank you so much for being here. We're so thrilled. We are a nonprofit collaborative accelerator dedicated to the science and practice of healing, and we hold these freely and for the public every month. They're generally on the first Fridays of every month, or our webinars, and then we have other special programming later in the month as well. We do this with the support of you. So one thing that we do offer for all of you that are watching worldwide, I know that this time isn't always convenient. You may want to send this to a friend to watch. We offer these. They're freely available for the next 48 hours. That is through the weekend. You will get, if you've registered for this, you will get a replay link so that you can watch it and share it with friends over the weekend. And then we ask for your support, because with your support, we can continue this kind of wonderful programming. It's very easy. Jason can pop a link into the chat window. You will get access to this recording and all webinars that we have held since 2017 in perpetuity with slide sets and more, freely yours to use and enjoy in your own time. And we ask for just a lovely sort of heart-based contribution of $108 a year or $9 a month, probably a cup of coffee and a half. And I think you'll get a lot more out of it per month if you join. So thank you so much for your time. Last little thing, we will have time for questions toward the end of the hour. If you have a question for Vikas or Vikas and Paul, simply pop it into the Q&A window. You'll just type in your box, if you're joining us here on Zoom, the little Q&A box, and you'll type in your question, and then Paul will get to those toward the end of the hour. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hop off screen and enjoy this along with you. Take care.
Thank you, Shamini. Thank you very much for the kind introductions. And greetings, Vikas. I am always so pleased at the opportunity to speak with you. As you know, we've had many meaningful conversations over the years that, if you don't already know, for me personally, are transformative. And so in that context, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today as part of the Chi Summit activity. So as everyone knows, today we're speaking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And specifically within that topic, we're going to be speaking about systemic inequality. What it is, of course, how do we recognize it? But from my point of view, more importantly, we're then going to move into how do we have honest, meaningful, and transformative dialogues on this topic. And within that, having and even beginning such a dialogue, frankly, is the beginning of what's often called restorative justice. So when we have meaningful dialogue, we're opening our hearts and our minds and our sense of vulnerability to have an honest appraisal of what really is going on here in our societies that some of us have been open to and understood, some of us have been somewhat blinded to. And when we open our hearts, meaningful conversation, then we can start moving towards having a more just and socially correct world, we could say. So again, Vikas, greetings. I know you'd like to start us off with a bit of music, in part to unify us and also to open our hearts and minds to our conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Paul Mills. I think I perhaps speak for a large number of us so respected, humbled to spend time with you today. And I absolutely reflect everything you've said. You've dropped some transformative one-liners as well as entire discussions. I'm going to start off today with a prayer. And the prayer is going to be based around the number 2088, 2088. And to my understanding, that's the current number of native children, native children's graves that have been found. And so we begin the practice with a very disturbing truth. And how do we do prayer around that truth? How do we hold space for love, compassion, peace, moving forward, and justice for this? Is the volume low? Is that what we're seeing?
Yes.
Okay, so let's see. Is that better? Is that better? Hold on, we'll take care of that. And thank you for pointing that out right away so that
Yeah.
the rest of the conversation can be heard well. Again, we've made an adjustment. Is that better? I think it is better now. Okay. All right, well, let us know. And to the hosts of the Chi webinar, feel free to pop in, unmute yourself, and just let us know. We would rather be interrupted and have everyone be able to enjoy the webinar. Okay. So I invite you to close your eyes. And bring into your hearts the feeling, the thoughts, sensations, images of children. Giving love to these children, giving peace to these children, bringing peace to their hearts, bringing peace to their families, bringing peace to all those affected. "2,000 children, Native Americans, indigenous people. And now let's bring awareness to breath. Just notice the breath, allowing feelings, sensations, and thoughts to run in the background. Noticing the breathing in and the breathing out. We're not running away. We're not attached. We are moving forward. And we will move forward in the best way we can. And we forgive. We forgive those who lacked the consciousness to know better. We do not forget. We hold accountable, but we forgive. Om Shanti. 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 Feel free to take a deep breath, looking down at the ground. Open your eyes as you breathe out, or keep your eyes closed. Thank you for that time.
Thank you, Vikas. There's so many directions we can begin our conversation, and I'm going to provide one direction based on my response, one of my responses to what you just shared with us. And I want to start us off here because I know it's a vitally important consideration. And it's also something you've been deeply working with your mindfulness work throughout the schools that you've been doing for many, many years, transformative work in the context of social justice. So when I heard you read about those children, as when I read it myself, when I read such things historically, I get filled with rage now, frankly. And I know that is, in one hand, perhaps a natural human response, but on the other hand, having that be front and center doesn't really go a long way into helping solving the kinds of things that we want to speak about today and bring people to a table to have an acknowledgement and honesty about what has taken place, and then start working on healing and the justice and so forth. So I'm going to start us with that. And
yeah, I think that is a great starting point. And as usual, me and Paul have already begun the path of doing nothing we had planned to do, but that's what I love. We have these organic discussions, and I agree with you. I think Chi having its emphasis on consciousness and healing, and a big part of this is energy medicine. And I'll speak for myself. If energy is truly neutral, you put your finger in a socket and it's going to shock you, whichever side of the socket you put it in. So then anger is also an energy. And if we label it anger, then, we are going to judge it and maybe push away from something that our body wants to do, something that our body needs to do. Sometimes when a rope that's winded one way unravels, it starts to wind the other way, right? And so maybe finding the information and becoming aware winds us one way, and then as we begin to process, we unravel, but then we often might wind the other way, which is where the frustration, the rage, that can come up. And I don't think energy is the issue. I don't think feelings and emotions is the issue. And I think threshold is part of the discussion. And so when we do the DEI work, and again, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to just abbreviate it DEI today. When we do this work, that's critical in any situation, because that's where we talk about kind of a trauma sensitive approach. And racism and all the isms and all injustices are traumatic. And again, I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not a scholar, so I am using the word trauma in a very broad sense to say that there are degrees of trauma, but injustice is a trauma. And when we reach threshold, then it becomes all that more traumatic, and that's what kind of enters the dialogue. So when George Floyd happened, or the Capitol riots happen, or the fact that we're finding these children that were buried in a past, and yet the present response is not acceptable. We can say it happened in the past, but the present response is really reflecting and mirroring where a culture of that past, the fact that it's not being responded to as a national crisis, a national emergency, a national day of mourning. We should be counting these children before we count the COVID rates, in my opinion. I mean, we really need to think about this history. So the mindfulness in this work is the ability to develop the threshold or the resilience, so that not only can we allow ourselves to really reflect on that anger and that feeling, but also know when we've had enough. Because if we go above threshold, we send ourselves into what I'm going to call auto disorientation. And auto disorientation is what I'm going to characterize is this rumination, meaning we can't stop thinking about something. And then there's this intensity, and that intensity is also a craving of intensity. So when we ruminate, then we want an intense response. We want to be intense, and we crave intensity from others. So we actually want to pick a fight, and if the other person doesn't fight with us, we're almost going to provoke them. Then we have this rigidity where we don't even want to hear anything else. And by rigid, we're impulsive. That's part of it. That's the fourth characteristic, but we're rigid in our mindset. So we're closed off. And so we have to be careful. We don't want to suppress. We don't want to judge. We want to be mindful. We want to accept our dashboard, which is our feelings. We want to say, wow, I'm really feeling this is really coming up for me. And maybe, look at our threshold. Okay, wow, I think I can still take more of this sadness, frustration, anger, rage. I can take more of it. Okay, I think I've reached my maximum point. I'm going to go play flute. I'm going to go garden. I'm going to do yoga. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to clean up my kitchen drawer. And then I'm going to revisit it. And I'll push that line a little bit more. And then again, it's like when you go to the gym, you start off with 10 pounds, then you go to 15, then you go to 20, then you go to 25, right? You're increasing your weight, but each time you're giving the body time to rest and to reacclimate. But I'm not going to suggest we push away the anger and rage. I think that's respecting the body's natural tendency. And as a social activist, this is where we would also get into the idea of shanti versus ahimsa, or peace versus nonviolence. See, in very different words, we should not be at peace with this. What is peaceful about this? Nothing is peaceful. If you're at peace with this, I have a problem. There's an issue to be at peace with this. So the anger is energy to fuel, hopefully, nonviolent social action. And
Yeah.
the reason I'm gonna say nonviolent social action, because if we revert and we go beyond threshold and the anger goes out of control, almost like driving a car too fast, it spills out and turns into violence, then we've become that very thing which caused the problem in the first place. And not entirely, but the seeds are the same. The seeds of hate, the seeds of anger, the seeds of a lack of regard for life, those are all the same seeds. And so this is really what we're here to talk about today is that kind of like, where's that balance of social justice, nonviolence, peace, and that ultimate kind of liberation, the oneness, the detachment.
Mhm. Yeah, indeed. I mean, what you just described, I've often seen that in marches for peace or social equality and so forth. There's a lot of anger and rage in there. So within the context of your work and others' work, educating us around DEI, and also moving that then to, discussions around restoration and what are we going to restore actually, and how we're going to do it. Is there often work within that to kind of emotional intelligence, this concept to help educate us how to manage our emotions, particularly in these settings where people have been carrying these burdens for multiple generations? It's just in there. How do you help people along the way with your work in that sense?
Yeah, the question is very important. The comment and the question that you make is very important, because when we talk about restoration, we really have to be clear about what it is we are restoring, right? So make America great again, right? We wanted, well, what is the again part? Can we talk about that part? Like, let's not just kind of like do that. I want to talk about that again part. So when we're talking about restoration, you're absolutely right. One, what are we going to magnify? What are we restoring? What are we throwing out? And what are we keeping? What was of value that needs to be kept? And what is no longer of value, or should we just need to kind of toss? It's now rotted away, or it's broken, or it's no longer serving us. So there's so many levels to everything we're talking about: DEI, trauma sensitivity, mindfulness, restorative practices, nonviolence, social change. There's a lot here. Based on my work, and right now I'm serving in the role of HR, employee relations, and mindfulness. And before this, I was director of mindfulness, and then we did a lot of other work as mindfulness in schools and in discussions. And as a scholar, an older scholar, because I was a scholar 20 years ago, I am not as much of a scholar anymore, but race politics was kind of my focus. I feel the greatest misunderstanding is around what we call systemic inequity, systemic inequality, systemic discrimination. And individual discrimination, bias is also an issue. Unconscious bias, we're going to save that for another topic. Unconscious bias in this discussion is a product of systemic discrimination. And by systemic discrimination, what we have to understand is when we're talking about equity and equality, when we're talking about kind of some way of undoing, of addressing, of confronting a very messy past. It's messy. Palestine and Israel is messy. Kashmir is messy, right? Because now we're at a point where the past was messy and the current situation is messy. I don't know what the right answers are. It's difficult. And when we look at systemic discrimination, particularly within the United States, we see that there was institutionalized laws and practices that disempowered specific groups of people. The fact that Native Americans were not given natural citizenship until 1940. So think about this. Just think about that. Native Americans were not given naturalization until 1940. So who was giving? Who was the giver? Who was the giver there? This is the whole dynamic, right? So then what happens is, from a systemic regulatory perspective, when there were rules preventing Black people, African Americans, from doing certain things like buying property, having jobs, having that independence for a long, long time. We're talking into the 60s and up until now. Institutional ways of being, meaning that certain neighborhoods were reserved for white people. Even today, if people of color or certain people based on certain characteristics are pushed out, now those folks have different opportunities at accumulating wealth, at living a certain lifestyle. And when they are discriminated against on certain qualities such as race, then all of a sudden when we look at the statistics, we see, oh wow, look at all these people of color, all these African American and Hispanic folks are poor. They must be the problem. A culture of poverty. Some of you are listening to me going, wow, he's talking about stuff in the 70s. Yeah, I'm sorry. I really shouldn't be, but I am. Culture of poverty? Yeah, because we're looking at it as if they are the problem, as if immigrants who live in the bushes are the problem, because that's the way they live. As if people of color who are drug dealers are the problem. As if people of color, low income people who are robbing things, robbing stores, are the problem. I ask you, who would like to live a life? Who would like to live that life? Who would choose to live that life? Who would choose to live the life of an illegal immigrant? Who would choose to live the life of a gangster who doesn't know if they're going to make it past the age of 25? In fact, they'll be surprised. In fact, they celebrate their 25th birthday. Who wants to lead the life of a Black male who on average does not live past 25 and has a 50% chance of being incarcerated? And where do we get that statistical number? Based upon the color of their skin, if there's no research supporting a biological difference. So when the institution creates the systemic ways that push groups of people into certain lifestyles and statistics, and then the statistics reflect it back based upon those characteristics, such as women are not good in science, women are not good at math, then all of a sudden we start to think, we're led to believe, the system is wanting us to believe that women are inferior, but there are systemic ways. There were institutionalized ways that created this reality upon those lines of discrimination. So now, when we talk about the DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm not going to talk about diversity. That's a deeper subject, but I want to focus on the equity and the inclusion piece, particularly on the equity piece, because people are having a really hard time with equality and equity. Why can't we just all be equal? We wish we could. We wish it was. But now we don't know what to do. We can't move backward and we can't move forward. Well, we're trying to move forward. But number one, the economic, political past is determining the current situation. The people in positions of power are reflecting the old power structure. So now the only way to undo that is in the same ways we discriminated and kept people out based upon race, gender, sexuality, and the income of the family they were born into. The only solution we can come up with is now maybe we should try to include them and promote them along the same types of lines that we kept them out on. So now, now the question comes, well, aren't we redoing the same past? Shouldn't we just be equal? Well, if we were to be equal, it would be equal to saying, I'm running a race. I'm just saying me. I'm going to say I'm that person of color that has been oppressed. And I'm going to show up to this race barefoot, while the person next to me has inherited high-tech gym shoes from their family. Not only have they inherited the high-tech gym shoes, but they inherited the networks of the judges that allows them to start 50 feet in front of me. And now you want to run the race equal and say, hey, man, you got to run faster to get to that finish line. It ain't my fault. We're all equal now. So while those in positions of privilege are those who have benefited from privilege, and by privilege, let's just say you weren't excluded. I'm not saying you got a gold apple in your mouth. Let's just say by privilege, those who were not excluded don't want to bear the burden of folks who did the excluding. But then who does bear that burden? The people who were excluded. So if we were to say we're all equal now, those who were excluded in the past, they're kind of screwed, aren't they? It's not fair to anyone. And because the past was not fair. Unfairness is not equaling fairness. And the complexity of the issue is magnified because the institutional discrimination, the institutional racism, the institutional patriarchy, the institutional taboo of the LGBTQ community, the institutionalized, the fact that we would not allow them to be legally married. This is so ingrained in so many levels of our government, our political system, our economic system, our cultural system, our social system, our educational system, our religious system, that it's messy to undo. And for those who weren't affected or were affected less, it's overwhelming. But there's some of us who live in that.
So how do we undo it? It is messy. You were just sharing with us some of the kind of downsides of forcing the equality equity, kind of reversing what was done, but there are downsides to that. How are you addressing it with your work?
Well, part of it is having these discussions right here. So as I'm talking, so one, Paul, how do you identify racially? Do you identify as a Caucasian or white male?
Yes.
Okay. Do you identify as a straight male?
Yes.
And would you identify yourself as economically, I'm going to say professional class, above average?
Yes.
Okay. So I also would identify as a male, as a straight male. I'm going to identify as a person of color, but I'm not indigenous or black. And I'm also going to identify as an above income, economically above average individual. So in some ways, you have certain privileges that I perhaps do not have from a systemic. Now we're not talking individual. We're talking from a systemic perspective. In certain ways, you were not discredited or disempowered from an institutional perspective. I was. However, you and I are talking. You asked me a question. You listen. You allow me to speak. I feel safe in speaking, being honest and vulnerable. And as I speak, I'm not nowhere here am I directing any of this at you. Right? Now we can go there as we go there slowly, but part of this restorative practice is one, being able to have that dialogue. So the first thing we did is we open up with ceremony. We open up with prayer. I open up with music. We kind of soften it. Then we're talking here back and forth. You never interrupt anyone. Everyone knows this.
I will if you want me to.
Go for it.
No, please continue.
Yeah, and I'm not, and so part of that is just respecting, listening, dialoguing. And when you talked about anger, and I said let that anger come up, in the same way, allowing my uncomfortableness, you allowing your uncomfortableness, allowing us to sit with it. And if we reach threshold, we might have to walk away for a bit and then coming back. Mm-hmm. And maybe even saying, that really made me feel uncomfortable. I had to walk away and I want to come back and address it. I want to kind of untangle this uncomfortableness again. I'm coming back to the table. And by me talking to you in a respectful tone, by me talking and listening, hopefully you feel safe enough to come back to the table. Hopefully I feel safe enough to come back to the table. Restorative practices is more about listening and less about being heard.
Huh.
DEI is about being heard, but the essence of restorative practice is really practicing listening.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. We spoke a little bit yesterday, just getting oriented to our session today. And one of the things I thought was really important, you shared with me then, and we'll share it now together, how denial plays into a lot of this domain. And so if certain historical events or current situations in the society are denied, no, that's not the situation, that's not the situation, that's a lack of validation, which furthers the experience of trauma and division amongst people. So today we started off with these children being found. Okay, we cannot deny that that event took place. We can't deny, you mentioned Israel and Palestine. We cannot deny the Holocaust took place, but many people do. So I'd like you to speak a bit about this issue of denial, and specifically kind of comparing and contrasting. How do you go forward in your restorative justice work when denial is still there? And that sort of means people at the table say there's no problem. You know?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we'll limit it to DEI today. However, this is really the question of the year, the question of the last 5 years.
Hmm.
Because there's this idea of how can I truly respect an opinion that is, one, maybe factually wrong, or clearly, deeply, and truly offensive to my entire being and my ancestors and my community. So KRS-One, in an interview, someone asked him about hip hop. Like, what about, hip hop's responsibility? And, a lot of artists will say, well, we're artists. We get to express our views the way we want to. It's not our responsibility to save the world. KRS-One had a different opinion. He said, hip hop did not pollute the youth. Hip hop didn't pollute the youth. But if you're going to put the issue of restoring the youth and social change, then we're going to take it. And as people of color, anyone outside the dominant paradigm, and so when we discuss diversity, one definition of diversity is everything that doesn't get questioned, or I should say everything that is questioned. So people are like, why do you have long hair? Okay, that's outside the dominant paradigm, because clearly no one's asking men about short hair. So when everyone outside the dominant paradigm, you can call it a burden or an opportunity. It's your choice. But there has to be this idea of walking the higher ground. And this is going to trigger a lot of people. I'm not talking about being an assimilationist. I'm not talking about being an assimilationist. But somewhere beyond the politics of the day, there has to be a sense of compassion for ignorance. And privilege breeds ignorance. Because privilege is things that you got that you don't even know that you have. It is of ignorance. And those who suffer are the ones who can educate the privilege, because you don't know you have privilege until someone who doesn't have the privilege tells you you have privilege. I don't know what I have as a man till a woman tells me what I have. Mm-hmm. So there has to be a sense of compassion, a sense of purpose, and to help people with that, or to motivate, and maybe I'm wrong. I apologize. I'm sure I'm triggering a bunch of folks right now. My advice to you is, whatever you do, if that was your last breath, because everything you say and everything you do, you will embody the intention of that before it happens. So whatever you say and the way you say it and whatever you do, if that was the last breath you died on, from a spiritual perspective, beyond the politics of the day, is that where you would want to die on? Is that the being you would want to die on? And in the Buddhist perspective, we would say the state of consciousness in which you pass is going to determine the next life. So that's really something to think about. And so in that way, I would say find common ground before building bridges. So even if I find a person that disagrees with everything I say, I know that if I dig deeper, I'm going to find human elements of fear, human elements of self-worth, human elements of mistrust, human elements of scarcity, fear of death. I'm going to find these pieces. And when I find those pieces, when I can truly understand, okay, I understand what's fueling this, then we can begin to build the bridge. But it's very difficult to build a bridge until we find common ground. And so I see a lot of this like with the vaccine discussion. You know, both sides are kind of hammering the other side. And my advice is until you can find logic in the other person's perspective, and I know that hurts. Oh, I know it hurts. I can't imagine as a woman what it would be like to find logic in a rapist's perspective. But I wonder if there's an issue of violence and self-worth. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's forgivable. I'm not saying it's forgettable. I'm not saying that they should not be accountable. But the only way to change those men is to understand their lack of self-worth and the violence that's going on in their heads. If we don't understand that, we're not speaking the same language, and that it continues. It continues. This is deep work. It is not easy. This is going to be very deep and uncomfortable work. And restorative practices, the very specific routine and rituals of restorative practices gives us a container to have these very intense, triggering, and difficult conversations. Are you there, Paul? I'm not seeing any movement.
He may have froze for a moment, Vikas, but it looks like he's coming back.
If he is frozen, I think I'll take.
I'm here.
Oh, great, Paul.
You mentioned a word a moment ago, the word compassion. And as being, from my point of view, that is one of the foundational bridges. You were saying earlier, first of all, we need to find a bridge when we're for the common ground for communicating in these topics. And this is what I so admire also about your mindfulness work and bringing mindful awareness, well, of course, into all of your work, but specifically this one, because it's evident for those who practice mindful meditation and other such parallel practices. Certainly the scientific research shows this again and again. Our innate compassion as a spiritual being becomes enlivened. Our capacity for empathy, our capacity for love and joyfulness all engage and are activated. So can you speak a bit about how your work in mindfulness has helped facilitate this kind of bridge building in the domains, whatever DEI or restorative justice? Because we can't have this conversation without a conversation about our spiritual nature. Because ultimately, as we've said so many times before in shared conversation, we're ultimately consciousness itself. And when we reside more from that domain, we do perceive the oneness that we share with other people. There's no other per se. And that ultimately is more of a truth of our identity. And when we can reside more in that domain, which practices like mindfulness help support, I think then we can really start accelerating and moving into the kind of vision and fruition you would like to see.
Well, I'll begin by saying if we talk about this within the container of mindfulness, it's going to be difficult because mindfulness has been reduced to stress reduction. And so there's nothing that's reducing our stress here. So let's talk about Vipassana and the true Buddhist roots of liberating the soul.
That's the one.
There we go, right? And detachment.
Yep.
And everything is impersonal. When I talk to sixth graders, when I talk to second graders, we talk about the ingredients of a cake. And we say, what goes in a cake? Usually the only thing they remember is sugar, but eventually we get to eggs and milk and flour and all these things. I said, oh, so does it taste like eggs? No. Does it taste like flour? No. I was like, it must taste like milk. They said, no. I said, well, what does it taste like? They said, it tastes like cake. I said, well, what happened to all the ingredients? They said, now they're in the cake and it tastes like cake. You don't taste the separate ingredients. And so I say, so what are the ingredients of anger? Is it loneliness, depression, previous anger, past violence, tired, hungry, sleepy? So if somebody's angry with you, should you be angry back at them? Oh, no. Now we see the ingredients. So mindfulness helps us in Vipassana to see reality as it is, to look deeper from an objective perspective. When I say things are impersonal, it triggers the DEI community. When I say be neutral, it triggers the DEI community. When I say be objective, but there's a difference here. We're not saying be neutral politically. We're not saying accept what's going on. When we become objective and we look at things impersonal, such as racism, we say, well, how can racism be impersonal? I mean, you're being racist against me, against my skin color. Yes, but if the person who was being racist was being personal, then they would know my story. It is because they do not see me as a person that they are being racist. Because they do not see someone as a person, they're being sexist, they're being judgmental, they're having stereotypes because, in fact, they don't see the person. It is the essence of being impersonal. So from mindfulness and Vipassana, when we see reality as it is, we understand this person doesn't see me. It's not about me.
That's beautiful. That's such a key point, because then that helps eliminate the being reactive to a person and it allows us to be responsive, which is more mindful, if I can use that word, and compassionate and in the moment.
Yeah, and I want to reemphasize non-violence, ahimsa. Ahimsa is knowing violence and acting against it in a non-violent manner. It is not ignoring the violence. You cannot be non-violent without violent. You just be non, which is like Indian bread, right? So you gotta be non-violent is to be aware, but still react non-violently, to respond non-violently to the non-violence. It is not to ignore the violence. So the spiritual community cannot close their eyes looking for peace. Open your eyes, see what's happening, and make peace with your position in that violence.
Yeah, beautiful. Another domain we've spoken about in the past for healing, and you really set us on this this trajectory at the beginning of our time together, was the role of arts and also of technology, which you've spoken about for facilitating all these domains. So will you speak about that a bit, and why does art work, for example?
Sure. So when I played the flute, I played a Native American flute, and I just want to give thanks to the Native community for creating such a beautiful instrument. And whether or not you allowed me, I apologize. I did play the flute. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's a part of my life. Thank you for bringing that instrument into the world. The flute I played happens to be a native indigenous flute maker from Canada, so I specifically chose that flute for the children's prayer today. When I played it, I played something in the background, a tanpura, which is Indian. It keeps us kind of in key. I probably sang out of key, but I think my flute was in key. So in that moment, I played what I was feeling. I didn't speak the words or the language. Now, everyone listening felt their own emotions. I blended Indian and Native American, and I blended my thoughts, my processes. So when I played that prayer to the Native children, I also played my own sorrow of what the Britishers did to my ancestors, and what America continues to do to people of color, to the Japanese, you know, putting them in internment camps. All of this stuff was going into that music. My identity was going into the music, my past, my present. There was prophecy in the music that I'll understand later. And all of this went into this graceful, beautiful thing that everyone could enjoy. And spoken word could be a little bit more literal and direct, but still it contains the grace. Because music and the arts has always been the best form of communication. That's the most powerful form of communication. Now we have technology, and in a moment, just like this video here, we can communicate and connect with more people than is ever humanly possible. So when you combine the message embedded within the arts, which is both direct, reflective, and prophetic, within the means of technology, you truly have a revolution. You have nonviolent social change. We need to talk about what's going on in our lives in spoken word, in song, and we need to put it on the internet, not run away from it. We need to make videos. We need to bring the arts. We need to paint rape. We need to really embody this and say, this is what I'm feeling. And if you have to turn away from it, go for it. But just know you're turning away from it, and that's okay. I understand you reach your threshold. But there's a certain grace in the arts, and there's a certain power in technology.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that. The universal language of the arts. I want to bring up one of the questions actually from one of the listeners. And before I share the question, I want to describe who this is. And she describes herself as a woman of color, a refugee with multiple intersectionality and identity. Some of our heart, I think, is hurt, bitten, and injured and chronically experienced historical and situational and political trauma. So the question is, Vikas, and we've been speaking to this, but I want you to do more of a deeper dive. How can we open our hearts? How can we start with, say, a small circle of activities and action for ultimately a larger outcome and transformation without being overwhelmed in the sorrow?
Beautiful. And
Yeah,
so in this
it's
question,
beautiful.
you've given the answer as well, because overwhelm is the piece we want to be careful of. So the heart is open, because if the heart wasn't open, we wouldn't be feeling these feelings, nor be able to describe what we just described. The heart is open, but the heart is hurt.
Hmm.
So if we work, the other beautiful thing about the arts is it works from the abstract, and then you slowly begin to understand it, and it can get very specific to help you understand. So the arts, in working in abstract formats to help kind of reflect and work through your stuff, can be easier. You don't have to be an artist. Native flute is actually very easy to pick up. As a musician who plays multiple instruments, pick up a canvas, pick up a pencil, and just pick up a pencil and start writing words, whatever comes to your mind, right? Spoken word doesn't have a format. Just start writing, just start writing, just start writing, and let it be abstract. Don't try to make sense. Let your body and your spirit do the work of unraveling. You don't try to control it. You're the one that's hurt. So in this way, I would really encourage creative expression, and I would not shy from the creative expression being intense in that way. Letting the creative expression really hold the intensity, and then just letting it reflect. Poetry is amazing because it does have words, and the words will speak back to you, not only in a week, but in years. It's prophetic. So I say write poetry, be creative, and touch and go. Touch and go. Touch and go means when you reach overwhelm, come back to the breath. Come back to the breath. Come back to the breath. And it's just a process of touch and go. I don't think that I have the understanding that that person who asked the question has. So I'm coming from a place of privilege in answering the question. But and then the other piece I would say is, as we're talking here, I'm going to really encourage everyone. They're going to share us slides through Chi, which I did not present, but I'm going to give it to Chi to share. And it has very specific ways to hold restorative circles. Hold a restorative circle in your family and communities with people that you trust. Start to do the work with the people that you trust, and then you can start to move out of that circle.
Beautiful, beautiful. You're getting some lovely comments back on your explanation and let's say assignments for us. Why is breath so healing? And you were advocating we go back and forth to it when needed.
Well, I believe it's healing, and so in our practice, in the Vipassana practice, we don't modify the breath. And so what happens is the reason all of the suffering is in the mind. The trauma is in suffering of the past. If we didn't remember the past, if I hit my head on something and no longer remember the past, the suffering would be gone. So, and then there's epigenetic suffering. So that's a whole other topic of, suffering in our genes. But for this conversation's sake, let's talk about the suffering that's in our mind. So what happens is the mind constantly needs to feed you, and it's going to feed you whatever it gets a reaction out of, just like children. Whatever a child does, if that behavior gets attention, then the child does more of it, and that's how your mind is also feeding you. So when we focus on the breath and observe the breath, what we're doing is we can't control the past, and we can't control the sensations, and we don't want to control our feelings because that's the dashboard. What we do need to do is anchor the thought from going from the past to the future and all over the place, because it's like a monkey. It doesn't really serve much of a purpose except to take us from past to future, and tie it tight like to a post, and that post is the breath. And when we tie the mind to the breath, we tie the mind to the present moment. And when we tie the mind to the present moment, right here, right now, hopefully, and for all of us who are watching this video right now, as a matter of fact, life is quite simple. We are alive and we are breathing. For those of us who are in war-torn countries, coming to the moment and something's falling on them, I cannot say that for them. But for those of us right here, right now, watching the video, life is not that complicated. Come back to the breath. All you need to do is breathe. And so when we come back to the breath and we anchor the mind on the breath, so the mind is not running on all the other thoughts, then all of a sudden we just observe the breath as it is. And in just observing and allowing the biology to unravel, so much of the conflict is that we don't want the body to unravel the way it wants to. We're like fighting ourselves. So when we just give up and say, okay, I'm gonna let the body unravel the way it wants to, it begins to find its own peace.
That's a beautiful observation. I mean, we're told again and again, the body innately is a self-healing organism, if I could put it that way. And not only on the level of healing wounds and so forth, but you're bringing our attention to the psyche itself. And so the breath, bringing us to the breath, you were describing, it helps heal the mind. What does it do for the heart itself, or the relationship of the mind to what we call the heart?
So I would say let's talk about the mind to the body, if that's okay. And so when we anchor the mind into the breath, once we can give the mind a demotion, demote the mind from the throne, what happens is once we focus on the breath and we're allowed to really focus, then all of a sudden we can feel sensations on the body. And we can bring awareness to exactly what's really happening in this right here, present moment. And when we are able to truly experience consciousness inside the physical body, we find infinite wisdom begins to rise. Infinite wisdom comes to come our way, but the wisdom comes through the body. The problem is the mind is that pathetic advisor that constantly takes the throne. And so we really have to anchor that mind to the breath first. And once we can anchor the mind to the breath, then we can begin to explore other sensations throughout the body, and not to modify it, not to judge it, not to wish it were different, but to simply be in the full human body experience, in the consciousness of the present moment. And in that present moment, don't ask me how, I'm not a scientist and I don't know how to prove it, but I will tell you, wisdom will rise. And the practice is the practice of accessing your inner wisdom. It is not for anyone to tell you what to do at any point in moment. I say be nonviolent, and at the same time, there are times when we have to be violent. There are times when children and women and people have to protect one another. So in that moment, we have to have the clarity of thought to know what to do when. We don't want to show love and compassion for everyone. I will never tell my daughter to show love and compassion for everyone, especially for men. That is not going to keep her safe. But clarity of mind will give her the wisdom to know what is going on and what she needs to do.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. As you were describing, when a person lives more in that, say, moment-to-moment state, I was imagining if everyone was there, has always been there, then historically we wouldn't even have needed to have this kind of conversation, because everybody would have been acting more from a kind of inner wisdom, and we wouldn't have gotten so far down this path. Can you?
I do want to say something right there. I constantly deconstruct everything to say, what is it? What is it? What is it? My mentor would say, poverty is the seed of violence. And I agreed with that for a long time. But now doing the work in the schools with so many different people, the issue is of self-worth. All our issues of greed, violence, overpowering others, injustice, all has to do with one's sense of self-worth. If people had self-worth, they would not hurt others.
Beautiful. Well, should we have that as our final thought, or would you like to give us one more thought as we are just at our time now, Vikas?
I would just like to say, I ask forgiveness for anything that I have misspoken on. I ask forgiveness if my words have given you more suffering. I ask forgiveness for my ignorance. I ask that you reach out to me and that you feel comfortable speaking to me. And please take the opportunity to educate me and bring awareness. And just, I ask forgiveness for all the ways that I've misspoken. And if for any reason I have brought more suffering to people than hope and clarity, I just ask forgiveness from that. And I thank my ancestors and all of your ancestors for being with us to make this happen here today.
Thank you, Vikas. I'm very grateful for our time together today. And I also want to thank the Chi Network for bringing us together and providing this conversation for our listeners.
So what do we do now?